My name is Alex Hershaft. I'm the founding president of the Farm Animal Rights Movement, or FARM for short. I went vegan in 1981 and vegetarian in 1961, 20 years earlier. If you're wondering why it took me 20 years to go vegan, it's because during all the time between 1961 and the late 70s and 81, I was absolutely convinced that I would die from lack of animal protein. I was still willing to be a vegetarian. Of course, by the time I became a vegan, the knowledge of nutrition had developed to the point where this was no longer an issue. I have a doctorate degree in chemistry from Iowa State University, and that actually was the same year that I became vegetarian, 1961. When I became vegetarian in 1961, there was no such thing as vegan. And mind you, I had just received a doctorate in chemistry, so I was somewhat knowledgeable in matters of not necessarily nutrition, but related matters. But I was still convinced, based on my conversations with nutritionists and my limited reading before the internet, just from books and articles, I was thoroughly convinced that I would get sick and eventually die by not consuming animal flesh. My theory was that before dying I would get sick, and once I got sick I figured I would have some meat until I got well again, and then I would resume being a vegetarian. The notion that meat was not only not essential but actually harmful to human health did not become established in the United States till the mid-1970s. And so becoming vegan in 1981 was just, that was simple, that was easy. Some people claim that becoming vegan in 1981 was not easy because there weren't many options in a sense of plant-based meats, and that's true. But I was never a foodie. I was not missing meat or cheese, for that matter. Food to me was just something that was essential for life, but I had many other interests besides eating.
Now you have some really great videos that already kind of explain why you went vegetarian. Is there any way to kind of concisely explain that and maybe potentially equivocally as powerful of a way, or should we just kind of reference those videos?
I became a vegetarian for two reasons. First of all, I was going through a period of my life where I felt very powerful. It was when I had first emigrated to Israel, and right after getting my PhD, when I was basically a graduate student in Iowa, which was a pretty lowly position in life. And I arrived in Israel on a doctoral appointment to teach at the Israel Institute of Technology. And suddenly I became a member of the most privileged class of Israeli society for several reasons. I had been born in Poland, and the Polish Jews were running the country at the time. I was from America, which is always a privileged place to be from. I had higher education, and I had a car, which at that point was a rarity in Israel. And I had an appointment in an Institute of Higher Education in Israel. There was really no way to be more privileged. And as a result, I felt that I could make any kind of decision I wanted about my life, which was a novel concept to me, because prior to that, there were other people making my life's decisions for me. So I was jogging outside of Haifa, where I was living at the time, and I came across a ceremony by a local tribe where they were celebrating the birth of a child. And they were, to celebrate that birth, they were going to slaughter a baby goat. And it struck me as very tragic that they would celebrate the birth of one child by murdering another. Just the concept of taking a beautiful animal and hitting him over the head and cutting up his body into little pieces and shoving those pieces in my face was kind of disgusting. And so I figured that I didn't have to keep doing that. And that's when I became a vegetarian. And that's where I also had to start facing all the threats to my survival for not consuming animal flesh.
This is a time when you realized that animals were something you didn't want to eat. But when did you realize the association or make the analogy between that and some of your other experiences? And talk about maybe that briefly, being a Holocaust survivor.
Right. So this was 1961, and then I stayed in Israel for a couple of years, and I married, and then my new wife and I returned back to the States in 1963, and I held a number of positions in different states, and eventually in the early 1970s I settled in Washington, D.C. I was hired by a consulting firm that was providing support to different government agencies and to private industry. My specialty, because of my chemistry background, was hazardous waste management. And one of my first assignments was to do a wastewater inventory at the Midwestern slaughterhouse, which was having problems with their wastewater, and the local municipal authorities. I was welcomed by the slaughterhouse manager and introduced to the wastewater areas, and I was walking around and taking careful notes, and I turned a corner and I came across these piles of hearts and hooves and lungs and other body parts. It immediately conjured memories of pictures of human hair and shoes and glasses that I remembered seeing at the Auschwitz Museum. And I couldn't get that association out of my mind. And my initial reaction was that surely I was overreacting. After all, these were only animals. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became of the analogy between what the Nazis did to us and what we're doing to animals. Going into a lot more detail in the book that I'm writing, but I listed about 13 major characteristics that defined both processes, and they were identical. In fact, the only difference was fairly trivial, which was the disposal of the corpses. In the Holocaust, that became a major problem. In the slaughter of animals for food, of course, we use the corpses.
The book you're writing on right now, is that something that you want to share a little bit about?
Sure. I'm writing a book which the working title is My Journey from the Holocaust to Animal Rights, and it traces the history of my transition. It's basically in three parts. The first part is an account of my experiences in the Holocaust, how I survived, mostly because of my mother's efforts. Third part is my experience in helping to build the animal rights movement in this country. And the middle part is the comparison between the Holocaust and the slaughter of animals for food. Go into a lot of details about the process itself, the similarity of the actual process, the definition of oppressors, the definition of victims, how the two sometimes are blurred, the whole topic of oppression and how to counter oppression and why we're doing it wrong. So, for example, right now, the way we deal with the oppression is we basically don't. It's a little bit like the way we deal with global climate. Rather than dealing with the causes of global climate change, we're building buildings that are resistant to flooding. We're dealing with protecting ourselves from the impacts of global climate change. Then we're doing the same with oppression, rather than dealing with the root causes of oppression, which is the revenge motive for financial gain or political control. These are the principal motives for oppression. Rather than dealing with those, what we're doing is we're protecting, we're addressing the protection of victims. And so as a nation, we're building huge armies to protect us from being oppressed by another country. And within the country, there are groups. We're building protection of specific groups. So there will be a group to protect women from oppression by men. There'll be a group to protect the disabled from oppression. There'll be a group to protect Jews and so on. And the groups are so totally focused on their preferred client victims that they will not allow any interference from any other protection groups. And all of the social justice, so-called social justice groups look askance at animal liberation groups because they think that we're comparing our victims with their victims. They don't realize that oppression is not about the victims. Oppression is about the sick, oppressive mind that needs to be cured or alleviated or dealt with. So I have very little hope that we will end oppression, and I look at with some sense of despair at all the victim groups today, and it's getting worse. I mean, there is actually a contest taking place between different victim groups over which victim is more oppressed and deserves more of our sympathies. We've seen that recently with the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. There's this and this maintenance of the Holocaust memories. There's this constant struggle between the victims. Me too, remember me. I was a victim too. I deserve your attention. It's pitiful.
If we address the issues with animal agriculture and how we desensitize our children to eat animals and forget about the victim of the animal, isn't that essentially when we first learn to discriminate and then potentially overgeneralize that into, well, I can treat others inhumanely because here I am consuming this abused animal. And it's not like we're actually thinking about this, it just becomes second nature because we're consuming this day in, day out, and it just makes us a less empathetic person overall. In all your research, do you feel like if we stopped eating animals, it could potentially make us more empathetic to people and everything else and less violent overall? Would it foster a non-violent culture? And in a sense, I feel like I'm saying animals are the most oppressed, and it's kind of like what you were just saying, who's the most oppressed? But maybe there is a core thing there that spills over into all these other things, and maybe eating animals is that core thing.
Animals are definitely the most vulnerable and therefore the most oppressed sentient beings on Earth. And ending animal oppression is the gateway, in my mind, to ending all oppression. And in fact, oppressing animals is the gateway to all oppression. And that is very evident, and it happens at the dinner table when a parent tells their 4-year-old child that the dog on his sofa is to be loved and cherished, and the pig on his plate is to be abused and murdered and cut into little pieces and consumed as food. This is the first time that child is imbued with the notion that his society permits one sentient being to live and prosper, while another sentient being that's not very different is condemned to a fate worse than death. And this is the first time that the concept of discrimination is implanted in a child's mind. And it creates a huge conflict because children have a natural affinity to animals. The very first toys they handle are shaped like little animals. Once they grow and listen to stories that they become emotionally involved with, these are stories of animals or involving animals. They then watch animal films and then their family dog becomes their best friend, even when their classmates or their very siblings may abuse them. So there is this natural affinity which then has to be reconciled with being told that some of these animals are not really friends. Some of these animals are really food. And it produces mental anguish, mental conflict, which is, of course, not very good for anybody.
Sometimes somebody's like, well, people should matter more than animals, as if they can't do both. And in my mind, I feel like if they do both, it would just accentuate or augment or even enhance their efforts in other areas. And so it doesn't really, in my mind, take away from being other types of activists. It could enhance other types of activism. Do you feel like that might be true? Because some people say you can't be an environmentalist or you can't be a feminist without being a vegan.
So a vegan is a person who addresses other sentient beings with respect, and as well as one's environment with respect. And so vegans obviously respect all human groups, all animal groups, and nature. Being vegan, in a sense, addresses all of the issues that other social justice groups address, except they do it incompletely because they only deal with one facet of the world that we deal with. We frequently run into the expression condoning the slaughter of animals, which is, quote, they're only animals, unquote. And the implication being that they have less value because they're unlike us. And that brings up the whole question of how we relate to different victims. And the simple answer is that we relate to different victims on the basis of our personal relationship with that victim. For example, we relate very strongly to members of our family, particularly our children, less so to distant relatives, less so to the neighbor down the street, and less so to a citizen of another country, in particular even different race, different continent, and so forth. The implication of this are interesting because we also relate more to our family dog than even to the person down the street. And that comes up sometime when it comes, for example, to medical expenses. If it takes $1,000 to save the life of our family dog, and that same amount to save the life of a person down the street that we haven't met, chances are that our dog will live. So, in truth, the value of a victim is not about their species, their race, their gender, their religion, their nationality. It's about how we relate to them. And if we want to make a general statement, then we're not allowed to base the value on our personal relationship. Then we must define the value in terms of the sentient of that victim.
Wow, a lot to think about. Stuff I've never thought about.
You will find that I want my book to be a difficult read. I want people to have to stop every paragraph and think about it.
Nice.
I don't want them to breeze through it.
When do you think that book's going to be ready? A couple of years?
The first draft will be ready in the end of May or early June.
Oh, okay.
But, then it's a long process to get it edited and get it published.
And how will people be able to find it? Through maybe your website or?
Well, I hope they'll be able to find it in their bookstore. But eventually, once it goes through the usual promotion and the book tour and all that, I would like it to be an open access. The book I found most useful in writing my book, which deals with every detail of the Holocaust. That book was an open access, and I was so grateful to be able to just get to it, download it, and...
Does that mean it's free?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. How can we get updates about yours, though? Like, maybe follow you, subscribe to your website or something? Is there a way to subscribe and get an update?
No.
So we'll just have to constantly be looking.
A lot of my thinking, in the last 2 years, I've been writing a blog, theveganblog.org. I would say 80% of what's in the book is in the blog. Some of the stuff I've come up with is recent, like I'm really fascinated by the concept of victims and oppressors, and that's fairly new.
You mentioned before we started rolling, the victim sometimes becomes the oppressor. It would be cool to capture some of that and share that because it was very enlightening and educational.
Yeah, but it's also very controversial.
Yeah, and it may not even relate, but it may. I don't know, because in a way, you did make it relate. You talked about how the slaughterhouse worker is the victim and the oppressor, but you went into how the Europeans became victims and oppressors.
Eastern Europeans, yeah.
Yeah. Even talking about how Nazis became oppressors and why, and how that may even help them understand the analogies, between all of this.
That's fairly recent stuff. It's a little different level than the other stuff we've been talking about, because it's very sensitive. Another little interesting tidbit is, we talked. You inquired about that scene at the slaughterhouse. That gave me deep anguish. I mean, I was at that point. I had been. Well, I was very American at that point. It was 20 years after I immigrated here, so it wasn't that I was newly American, but I was somewhat patriotic. I mean, I had very high opinion of America, and being faced with this prospect that we were doing something very similar to what the Nazis did to us. I mean, the Nazis were monsters. I mean, that was... So you have to understand that the average Jew, which I was in some sense, there was no consolation. I mean, normally when something bad happens to you, well, yeah, I guess if you're in an automobile accident, there's no way to console yourself. But maybe you were driving too fast. But in this case, the only comment, not even consolation, the only comment that we could make was the Nazis were monsters. They were horrible people, and that didn't really give us consolation, but it provided maybe a little explanation. And for me to find out that we were in effect Nazis to the animals, I mean, just think about this, how that turns your whole life upside down. So I was in deep shit. I was a basket case. I didn't know which way was up. And that's when the only thing that saved me was coming across the writings of Isaac Bashevis Singer. One of his characters says, in relation to animals, all people are Nazis. In relation to animals, life is an eternal Treblinka, referring to the death camp where 900 million Jews were gassed. And I said, oh, wow, somebody else thinks that. And no less than a famous author. He wasn't, this was before he got the Nobel Prize for Literature, which that would happen in 1978. This was 1972. But he was already, people knew who Isaac Bashevis Singer was. What I later discovered in reading about his writings just recently is that same year, he was a new immigrant to the United States. He came here after I did. And he had his own demons. Partly the animal thing, but others as well. And he went through a huge mental anguish at the same time in 1973, and he wrote about it. He actually wrote a book in the late 70s talking about his anguish. It's just a coincidence that it happened at the same time, that I found salvation in his writings and he was undergoing his own anguish.
Part of your way to resolve this was to find a way to compensate essentially through your farm and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk about that some. How did that all come together mentally, and how did it all come to fruition?
Knowing that one other human being, and particularly a noted Jewish author, had agreed with me, it was of great comfort, and did a lot to resolve my anguish, and allowed me to channel my feelings, my anguish, into a positive channel. And I resolved right then and there that I would devote the rest of my life to ending the use of animals for food. And that gave me a positive channel for my anguish, for my emotions. But back then, I didn't really have the means to do so. So I had to be patient. That opportunity came up 3 years later, in 1975, when I attended the World Vegetarian Congress. Now, in Orono, Maine, in August of 1975. Until then, I was very personal about my vegetarianism. Remember, I became vegetarian in 1961, so now by 75, this is 14 years later. All that time, I kept my vegetarianism private. It was a personal matter, partly because it was not popular or even an accepted way to be, and partly because I wasn't sure that I could survive it, and partly because I didn't know any other vegetarians. I had a lot of trepidation about attending the 1975 Congress. I didn't know what other vegetarians looked like. I didn't know if they would like me. I didn't know if I could be open with them. I didn't know if I would like them. But I also knew that I had to go. Because, first of all, if I was going to continue as a vegetarian, I had to talk to other vegetarians, and it might allow me to pursue the resolution that I made 3 years earlier, in 1972, after witnessing those piles of body parts. So I went, and it was literally a life-changing experience for me. Everywhere I looked, there were people of different genders, different nationalities, different dress, different age, different economic station. And the only thing they had in common is they didn't eat animals.
It's a beautiful experience.
It was a life-changing experience, eh? I felt that I finally found my people, that I belonged. It was such a feeling. I mean, I get emotional to this day, remembering that. And I knew immediately that this would be my opportunity, my one opportunity to implement my resolution. And I became active immediately after that. And I started the Vegetarian Information Service. which distributed information on vegetarianism for the next 5 years, and then eventually became an animal rights organization, the Farm Animal Rights Movement in 1981, but that's a different story.
Just give us a brief synopsis on this other story, Farm Animal Rights Movement.
This is turning into my book. Vegetarian Information Service was mainly distributing information on the merits of vegetarian eating. Because I was living in the Washington area, and because I had the PhD letters next to my name, I was also able to testify before various government panels dealing with nutrition and human needs. One of the panels I testified before was the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, which ended up with the original report called the Dietary Goals for the United States, which was the first official government document that basically implied that meat, animal flesh, was not essential to human nutrition. And eventually that transformed into the dietary guidelines for America, which is now a 5-year process that still involves a lot of contest between nutritionists and social justice folks on one hand, and the meat and dairy industry on the other. But the other thing we did is we had little conferences, just little local conferences. And at these conferences, there were folks talking about this strange new concept called animal rights, which to me sounded like tree rights or rock rights would sound to somebody today. There were a couple of interesting things about those folks. One was that they were ending up the same place where we were, which is that animals should not be eaten. And the other thing was that they had a lot of enthusiasm, whereas by then the vegetarian movement had kind of settled down and became more of a social movement. In the wake of the World Vegetarian Congress, there were about 60 local vegetarian groups started, but they became kind of social groups. The members met and had picnics or dinners, or they were not social action groups, whereas the animal rights people were all about social action. And so it occurred to me that this might be a marriage made in heaven, as they say. Here the vegetarians were everywhere. I mean, they were all over the country. You had vegetarian groups. The animal rights people were scarce. There were just like maybe a dozen, the activists, but they had all the idealism, they had the energy. It just seemed to me like if I brought those two together, that something good might happen. And so in 1981, I arranged a conference in Allentown, Pennsylvania, at the little college called Cedar Crest College, which was just a bigger vegetarian conference than the other ones that I had arranged. But it had an important new element, and that is it welcomed all the animal rights activists that I could find. And that basically became the birthplace of the animal rights movement. The animal rights people took over. The vegetarians had to make one little adjustment. They had to become vegan, and they lived happily ever after.
Now, how did you come up with this name, though, farm?
We were concerned about farm animals because of the numbers, And for the first 20 years or so, we were the only organization addressing the farm animal issue. But once you start with farm animal, then you need 2 more letters to end up with farm. Rights movement became the rest of the name.
And you're also a part of the animal activist mentorship.
We're supporting them.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, we're separate organizations, but we appreciate the work they do and we support them.
Do you think we'll ever see a vegan world, and how can we get there?
It sort of depends on your definition of a vegan world. If you mean a plant-based eating world, yes, definitely. And we really don't need to do anything special for it to get there. It'll happen naturally because of the scarcity of food resources. What we can do by promoting plant-based meats and dairy products is to make it happen faster and with less suffering. But regardless of what we do, eventually it will be a plant-based world. If you mean a world where people hold vegan values of goodwill towards all sentient beings, I doubt it very much. I think people are naturally too selfish to become vegan in large numbers.
If people were eating plant-based and now they're raising their children without this cognitive dissonance, maybe it could be a vegan world. And what would it look like?
They would certainly be more open to vegan ideals once it didn't involve changing their lifestyle 3 times a day. I don't think there would be a mass exodus towards veganism.
Yeah. One question I usually ask people earlier in the interview is, how do you define veganism? Maybe this is a good time for you to do that.
It's not up to me to, all I can do is observe what's real and report. I do not get to I can only define veganism for myself. But in terms of my observation, I recognize 4 levels of people who define themselves as vegan. There are the casual or the social vegans. These are the people who think that it's kind of cute or clever or seasonal, and they stop eating animal products for a few weeks and play with it. Then there are the animal rights vegans who believe in animal rights and refrain from eating animal products because of that. And then there are what I consider true vegans, which is people who, to the extent that they can, refrain from all activities that harm other sentient beings, not particularly animals. And then there are the ahimsa vegans, which I consider myself, which apply the vegan principles to human beings as well as animals.
Wow. That's interesting, because we just came from the Dinshaw family, learned a little bit about that. Were you influenced by them at all?
Yes. Can you be more specific?
No, I'm just curious.
I was more...
Well, because they in some of their, that was their early publication was called
Oh, no. Not ideologically. But my life was changed. In 1973, Jay went to the World Vegetarian Congress and said, I want to do the 75 Congress in the United States. And they laughed. I said, what? You want the United States to have a vegetarian Congress? Who's going to do it? There are no vegetarian organizations in the United States. There are, there were the Seventh-day Adventists. I mean, they were strong in the middle 80s, in the 1800s, not 80s, 1800s. That's when Kellogg was big, and that's when the White and the Seventh-day, the whole Seventh-day Adventists. But that settled down. They were no longer advocates. There's still a Seventh-day Adventist church, but they are not out advocating. Who's gonna do it? I mean, there's no vegetarian tradition. This is crazy. And Jay said, trust me. Trust me. And they said, okay, we trust you. And that's the only reason this happened, was because they trusted Jay. Not, that's it. Because Jay said he could do it. They agreed. And Jay formed the North American Vegetarian Society specifically to host the Congress. And that Congress is what changed my life. So, yeah, I mean, I owe everything to Jay.
Wow.
I wouldn't be who I am if it weren't. Maybe some other way, but...
Do you have a favorite quote you like to share?
The quote that had the biggest impact on me was Isaac Bashevis' Singer quote, that for the animals, all men, all people are Nazis, and for the animals, life is an eternal Treblinka.
I also like to give people an opportunity at the end to share anything that we didn't cover.
Look at the vegan blog.
Yeah.
There are 60 installments, 60 blogs, 63 blogs.
Okay, cool.
And, they all have interesting ideas. I mean, none of them are just chit-chat.
You have something you want to share with people, like how to connect with you? Are you on Facebook, YouTube, these things?
So I have accounts, but I'm not active on any of those.
Okay.
I have I have an author account on Facebook, and I have a personal account on Facebook, and I have a website that lists all my distinctions, alexhershaft.com. And I also have a website that deals with the Holocaust, which is never-again.org. I have an Instagram account, I have a Twitter account. I'm not active on any of those. Welcome to our poster wall. These posters are associated with our annual Grassroots campaigns. The most famous of those are World Day for Farm Animals, which was launched in 1983, right here, World Day for Farm Animals. These three mostly, that was started in 1983. And then in 1985, we launched the Great American Meetout, which is over here. And the idea of grassroots campaigns was to activate people at the grassroots. Back in the 80s, the movement was entirely at the grassroots. That was before the big money came into the movement, and before the organizations that you're familiar with grew to the extent that they are big today. And they basically ended up hiring all the local activists. So there are many fewer local activists now, and as a result, the grassroots campaigns today are a mere shadow of what they used to be. This was actually our very first campaign, the veal ban campaign, where we tried to get people to stop eating veal. And that actually turned out to be fairly successful. Veal consumption is way down today. This is a painting by Sue Ko famous vegan artist that you may know. She does a lot of paintings that are pretty gruesome.
I like this over here too, this rooster. Food, not bombs. They feed people, right?
That's food, not bombs.
Yeah, yeah. Share a little bit about that, because I think that's really interesting.
These are folks who have managed to associate their promotion of veganism with their drive for peace and absence of war. That's kind of a logical combination that I wish more people would take to heart.
And they feed hungry people, right?
Yes, they do.
I came across them in Denver once. I was blown away. I never heard of it before.
Yeah, it's a very, very active organization. Mm-hmm. They combined those three causes, basically: veganism, homelessness, and peace.
Wow.
Yeah, some of these are duplicates.
Oh, okay.
These are our bus cards. We used to advertise on buses.
I've seen some of that in New York, that kind of stuff. You know, at the bus stops. Were these at bus stops, or were these?
No, these were on buses.
In the bus?
In the buses.
Or on it?
Inside, just above eyesight.
I like these 4 food groups.
That's a cover to a handout that we use.
And you want to share anything about Obama over there?
Well, that was for my birthday, my 80th birthday.
Yeah, that reminds me, you didn't mention, what's your next birthday going to make you? Or do you want to share that, or you want to keep that a secret?
Nah.
And then you got the Hall of Fame here.
The Vegetarian Hall of Fame was awarded to me in 1998. What happened as a consequence of the World Vegetarian Congress in 1975, since Jay ended up forming the North American Vegetarian Society to host the Congress, the society continued having conferences every year since then. And I used to speak at them regularly, and that's when I was awarded that certificate. We get hundreds of proclamations for World Day for Farm Animals and Great American Meat Out from state governors and city mayors. I think this is San Francisco, Los Angeles, state of Illinois, state of Alaska, Sarah Palin, state of Iowa, state of Louisiana, and that's San Francisco also. Oh, sorry, this is Houston.
Oh, Houston.
These are just a small sample.
What do you mean a small sample? You got more than that?
Oh, we got hundreds.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. We get them in consecutive years.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, sometimes they cause a controversy, like about 10 years ago, governor of Michigan declared meat out in Michigan, and that caused a lot of controversy. The meat industry complained loudly, and then last year we got a declaration from the governor of Colorado, and that caused a lot of controversy, as you can imagine. And the governors of neighboring state declared Meat Day to encourage people to eat more meat. But anyway, to us that's fine, because all we want to do is have people think about what they're eating. So whether you call it Meat Day or Meat Out Day doesn't really matter, as long as they think about the consequences of what they're doing.
Have you ever had any backlash come at you personally from the media?
Not personally, no.
I know in the beginning when I was imagining all this, it seemed like there was some fear that, you know, they might try to silence activists. But I guess that's never happened to you, right? Not
in any bad way. We used to have annual visits from the South Dakota Meat Council or something. As part of their educational process, they would come here and talk to us, but not hostile.
Oh, that's good to know. That's encouraging, actually.
Well, as part of their educational process is to meet with opponents.
I stumbled on a newspaper. A local farm was a part of the USDA's program to educate children on how cows are raised. The school can adopt the cow and learn about it and it growing up peacefully and all that.
Yeah, that brings to mind an interesting video we did. The Dairy Council in California had a program where they had a cow and a calf in a trailer, and they were going around to schools and they were having school assemblies where the guy was explaining where milk comes from. It's about like a 3-minute video. So I had this idea. I wrote up a script trying to be consistent with the timing. So, I knew exactly how much time he said this in this picture and how much and so forth. And I wrote a script that matched the timing. Eric Lindstrom, our new executive director, who was working for Farm back then, this was about 5 years ago, he actually read the script too and replaced the original script in the video. And it's quite funny.
Welcome back. Learning is always more interesting when it's hands-on. One program is teaching kids about where their food comes from in a most interesting way.
This elementary school in suburban Oklahoma is welcoming a rather unusual guest, a dairy cow, whose entire life is a cycle of chains, artificial insemination, pregnancy, painful machine milking, loss of her newborn babies, and slaughter. These youngsters are learning about the dairy industry.
Who wants to learn the truth about cow's milk? What these little misses and fellers don't know yet is that dairy milk is intended for baby calves and not humans. In fact, it's loaded with saturated fat, cholesterol, pus, and hormones that make it downright hazardous to kids' health.
Here, children line up to pet a newborn male calf. This little guy's only role in life is to get his mother to produce milk and serve as a dairy industry prop. He is about to be killed and consumed as veal because he can't produce milk. The good news is that every supermarket now carries a rich variety of delicious, convenient, and healthful plant-based milks, cheeses, yogurts, and ice creams. Who wants to give up dairy?
And sometimes in school, you learn how to milk a cow. Always something new.
It's an interesting take. It was done for us in Israel.
Yeah.
They got a lot of criticism.
Hot dogs.
Yeah, Dr. Greger makes that analogy a lot.
That was fun doing that. I like humor. I guess if there were no problems in the world, I would probably. I don't think I would perform comedy, but I'd like to write comedy. I really enjoy humor. I really welcome this sort of thing.
Yeah, Dr. Furman, he has a lot of jokes, and he says it is one of the keys to longevity.
Well, it's also a key to social transformation. I think comedians really are able to say things that other people are not able to say.
And hopefully not get slapped.